We're here talking, of course, to Patrick O'Brien. He's been a longtime friend of the National Maritime Historical Society. He's also the president of the American Society of Marine Artists, and our two organizations have kind of an intertwined history and have both been working with each other for many, many years. Patrick, of course, is a very well-known professional artist. He's been doing this for decades, and his work has appeared in magazines, newspapers, posters, greeting cards, you name it. We're so excited to hear what he has to say about his work, about his process. And without further ado, Patrick, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I can see some familiar faces there. I see some of your faces. Good to see you. I won't call you out by name because I'm going to miss some people, but I see a lot of you there. So I am going to share my screen so I can do this presentation. So you won't see me for a little while, but here we go. I'm going to start sharing my screen. I can find the right buttons. Okay. Are we all seeing that, right? We're all seeing Patrick O'Brien. Okay. So I'd like to start by getting this out of the way right at the beginning. This is not me. This Patrick O'Brien, as most of you here probably know, was the author of lots of really good novels about the sea. I get it all the time. People see my paintings and they think, but I didn't know he painted too. In fact, at a gallery a few years ago, a man came up to me and said, I'm a big fan of your work. He says, but you know, I've only read your novels. I didn't see your paintings before. So I had to decide, do I tell him, you know, because he'll be embarrassed and he'll think that I'm embarrassed. Not only that, I'll lose a fan. But I obviously share some of the same interests as that other Patrick O'Brien, but he died in 2000 at the age of 86. And let me just note that that was not his real name, but it is my real name. So now that we have that out of the way, for those of you not familiar with my work, I'll show you some examples, and then I'll get into exactly how I put these paintings together. So I paint a lot of old ships, the age of sail, and mostly what I call the age of fighting sail. So that means in American history, since I mostly paint American scenes, I start with the Revolution and give a lot of coverage of the War of 1812, which is when most of the cool stuff happened. The Barbary Wars in the Mediterranean is a good source. And then up into the Civil War, when sail turned into steam. And somehow the ships just weren't as picturesque after that. You know, there's a certain grandeur, inherent grandeur into a sailing ship that, to my mind, the later ships don't have. So I paint a lot of battle scenes and just sailing ships at sea. But it's not all wars. I like to do recreations of old waterfronts. This is obviously New York. This is the right around here. If you can see my cursor, this is where the Fulton Fish Market is right now. That's obviously the Brooklyn Bridge. The USS Brooklyn sailing underneath. There's the Fulton Ferry going across the way, soon to be put out of business by the new bridge. This is right after the bridge was built. Charleston, South Carolina, just after the Civil War. Sometimes I go into more modern times. I've been doing a series of paintings for Lockheed Martin of Japanese destroyers. Lockheed Martin is providing missile launchers to these destroyers, and not the missiles, but just the launchers. And so they they put a they send the Japanese Navy a corporate gift which apparently is common over there in Japan, corporate gifts, and their corporate gift is these painting of the destroyer with the missile launcher on it. And then they actually build a niche in the wardroom of the ship, especially for the painting. So the paintings are sailing around the world on these ships. And by coincidence, I guess I ended up doing almost the same thing for Exxon. Corporate gifts for the shipyard that built the ships, and it's the same thing. These paintings are also sailing around the world on these ships. So I guess they're my most well-traveled paintings. So that's a bit about the kind of work I do. I'm often asked, how can you paint a realistic picture of something that you haven't actually seen, that you really can't see? Like, you can't just go out at sea and see a battle between two ships in 1812. Well, using I guess you would call it a process that I call imaginative realism, which is also the name of the class that I teach at the Maryland Institute College of Art. Basically, if you want to, I can paint if I want to paint a portrait or a landscape or a still life, I can have a person sit in front of me, or I can go outside and paint a landscape. You can look at it and you can paint it. You can paint what you're seeing. But what if I want to paint a historic scene, or say prehistoric animals or fantasy scenes? You're doing a realistic picture from your imagination, essentially. Basically, what you do to put this scene together is use your background knowledge of how color and light behave in various situations. You educate yourself about form and shadow, and then it's about a lot of extensive research, taking reference photos, making models if need be, and then lots of preliminary sketches. So I spent my whole adult life building up my knowledge of color and light and how it behaves on a form. In my mind, painting a ship at sea shouldn't be that much different than painting a portrait or a landscape or a still life. Either way, I'm painting light falling on forms. Painting outside helps you learn the effects of light, and it's that kind of thing. It's sort of the kind of thing you can't read about in a book. And it's also difficult to articulate. You just have to go out there and do it and soak it in. As a hobby, I like to paint people from life. I go to the open life drawing sessions at MICA and various places where I teach painting from nudes and portrait models. And again, it all informs how you learn about light and color, and the way light defines shapes and colors on, even on a face, informs all my other paintings. And then I do an awful lot of research, which I'll talk about in much greater detail in a little bit. Last summer, not last summer, a couple summers ago, I was lucky enough to be invited onto the Constitution turnaround cruise in Boston. So what they do with the USS Constitution, which is still the actual ship that fought in the War of 1812, and it's still a commissioned Navy ship, but it lives at the pier in the Charleston Navy Yard, and many of you probably know this. Once a year, they cruise it out into the harbor, turn it around, and bring it back to the pier on the other, so that it's facing the other way, so that the ship weathers evenly, so that the wind and rain don't hit the ship from the same side for decades. So they make a bit of a production out of it, the turnaround cruise. So this was a good chance to really explore the ship in great depth and take a look at all the parts in great detail, and really just soak up the atmosphere of the thing. This I thought was sort of the best seat in the house. This is the captain's seat of ease. This is where the captain would relieve himself. He was the only person on the ship that had any sort of privacy on the toilet. As many of you probably know, everybody else had to go and use the head up front, just a hole on a board up front. But he had his own real comfortable seat there. You can see it right here. If That's the quarter gallery. That's those windows I was just in. And that's his seat of ease. Stuff can just drop straight into the ocean from there. So the ship was accompanied by a whole flotilla of boats the whole time, fire boats, fore and aft. These are all U.S. Navy sailors sailing this boat. We fired the guns at the fort at the entrance to the harbor, and they fired back. The captain really got into it, really got into the role. This is, he's a real U.S. Navy captain. Now, the younger generation, they just couldn't quite handle it. This was 4 full hours with no electrical outlets, no USB ports, no nothing. They just, they can't take it. So I soak up all those influences into my brain, what I know about color and light and form, and combine it with my research and reference. And then I put it all through my brain, through the Patrick filter, and spit it all back out onto the canvas. And that's basically imaginative realism. So I'm going to stop every once in a while if people want to ask me questions. And I told Kathy and Heather that they can interrupt me when they want to if they have questions. But
Yeah, Patrick, a lot of the questions that came in ahead of time, and I think this is what you're about to go into, really want to know about your process, and that includes the historical research as well as, how you characterize um, uh, water and the surfaces of a vessel and how you make that look so realistic.
that is exactly what I'm about to talk about.
Perfect.
All that stuff I just talked about was the intro. Now here comes the presentation. So I'll start by, I had to pick something, I had to pick a painting to use as an example. So I'm going to use this example, a painting of the Battle of the Chesapeake that I did. So I was commissioned to do this large painting of the battle. It was a battle between the British and the French, but it was during the American Revolution, and the French were on our side. So basically, without going into the history of it, it allowed the battle, the French semi-winning the battle allowed General Washington to defeat the British at Yorktown and win the Revolutionary War. So it's a pretty important battle in American history, even though it wasn't, the Americans weren't involved. So it took place right here. It took place right about here. Sometimes it's called the Battle of the Virginia Capes because of this cape and this cape right here. But it took place right outside the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay. So I start any project with research. I was able to go to several primary sources for these, like letters and memoirs of some of the participants in the battle itself. I like these primary sources because they're not an historian's interpretation, but they're firsthand accounts. A lot of time, almost every battle I've done, you can dig up letters that the captain or the admirals have written back to the admiralty, or in American terms back to the government, and the captain always sort of describes all the evolutions of the battle. Now look at old charts of the battle, like this. A lot of these old charts are not particularly accurate, really, but they're more like diagrams of an idealized battle. So using these sources, I was able to put together my chart of the way I think the ships were positioned. Both of the ships formed along lines of battle, which I won't get into right now, but I chose to depict the point where the lines of battle sort of came real close to each other right here. And I thought that would be the most dramatic part of the battle to depict. That was the overall action of the battle, but then I had to examine the details. So this is, I got friendly with the curator at the Naval Academy Museum, Jim Cheevers, who some of you probably know. casts a big shadow in this field. Um, he had a great collection of old books and manuals in his office. He's sort of a walking encyclopedia of all things naval history. And one of the best things that I found that he had was this old signal book. Ships in those days communicated with signal flags, which were a code that, that gave orders to other ships, but were unreadable to the enemy. They had to change the code every once in a while. Once they figured the enemy might have figured out the code, so they had to change it every once in a while. So these books, because they were sort of temporary, I suppose, they were this book was hand painted. You can see every little flag there is hand painted, a tiny little watercolor. And all that writing is done by hand. So this is the actual signal book from the 1780s. Shows all the different flags and all their different combinations. So I really thought that these little books were works of art in themselves. So I knew from my reading that during the battle, they flew the signal for engage the enemy. And so I was able to look up in this book that he had in his office, the actual signal for engage the enemy. You can see here signal flags. To engage the enemy, if closer, a red pendant will be shown over the flag. So here's the symbol, these two flags. You fly that if you want to show engage the enemy, or the red pendant if you want to make them closer. This says, this next one, to denote that the signal made to the admiral is not distinct or understood. So it's really kind of interesting to see these things. So sometimes I hit the wrong button here. And later on, no, earlier in the battle, there was they had flown a signal for enemy in sight when they first saw the enemy. And you can see enemy in sight is this red flag. So I was able to make sure I got the flags right on this painting. I figure nobody can tell me I've got them wrong if I went straight to the source. I've also got a lot of other books in my studio, and from these I've learned the details of old rigging and sail handling, especially this book. This is a really terrific book. Everything about sailing these old sailing ships. Going into extreme detail, taking apart the whole thing. There's the standing rigging and different picture for some of the running rigging. To most people, the rigging on a ship looks like a confusing spider web of ropes, but when you know the system, it all makes perfect sense. I try to make it my painting so that you could sail the ships with the rigging I put on there. Details of how they furl the sail. I've used this sometimes when I want to show this particular time on my paintings. This is a really nice book I found that's got a lot of old architectural drawings of the ships that were drawn at the time in the shipyard of these ships. So I'm able to get the details of the hull and all the accurate details there. But one of the most useful resources for me has been the Gallery of Admiralty Models at the Naval Academy Museum. So these Admiralty models were built at the same time and in the same shipyard usually as the ships themselves. So I take them to be absolutely accurate. So they were used to show the Admiralty or the King what kind of ship was being built. They're incredibly detailed. In fact, some of them have details inside that you can't see without sticking a fiber optic cable through one of the gun ports and looking around with this little camera on the end of a fiber. So you sort of wonder why they built details like that really couldn't be seen in their day. These lion figureheads were very typical of the Royal Navy ships at that time. That was sort of the almost the default figurehead at the time. And you can see these models are just, to me, they're just breathtaking works of art in themselves. Craftsmanship, like very, very, very few people can do that these days. And then I also take pictures of modern replicas whenever I can. It's the Bounty up there, the reproduction that they made for the Marlon Brando movie that unfortunately sank a while back in a storm. Living in Baltimore, I get a lot of chances to see these kinds of replicas in the harbor. This is the Pride of Baltimore. It's a classic example of a Baltimore clipper, which was a common type of topsail schooner built in Baltimore. They were famous for their speed and were often used by privateers for that reason. But I find this to be the best looking rig, and I've used this ship in paintings many times, many times. So, you get to see these replicas and you have all these details like this that would be really hard to find otherwise. You can't look so complicated. You can't make this stuff up. So now it's time to start sketching. In the old days, artists depicted battles at sea from a great distance so that you could see the whole battle taking place. But I thought it'd be more interesting to see the battle from more inside the action. So I put together a view like this. And it's as if the viewer was at this point. If you remember that chart I made, I'm positing that the viewer is right there, and they're seeing these two ships that are pretty close together, not yard arm to yard on, but fairly close. In this battle, they didn't get yard arm to yard on, and so I did this sort of very rough sketch, and then I turn it into a color study with watercolor. So then a little watercolor sketch. There's still a lot of fiddling around to do at this point, playing with the color of the water and the color of the sky and designing the water. The way the waves look is really sort of has to be designed. The light on the sails, etc. Once I get the color study just right, then I go to the canvas. Once I get onto the canvas, I want all the major decisions to have already been made so that I'm not improvising or experimenting on the canvas. So I transfer it to canvas with pencil and then start painting. I'll show you a series of pictures of how the painting progressed. The idea is what I like to do is build up the whole painting at once. In other words, instead of finishing the sky and then painting the ship and then painting the water, I paint the whole painting at one time. I try to block it all in and bring up all the details at the same time, so that it all is more coherent. You can see how the water is really just blocked in, and the sky is more or less just blocked in. The sails are just kind of blocked in. At this point, I kind of realized I had a problem. I didn't have a good view of that figurehead, that lion figurehead that I like, at just the right angle with just the right lighting on it. So I took a break, and using Sculpey, I made a little model of that typical lion figurehead. Looks like this. Sculpey is this kind of clay that it's a polymer clay, and you can form it and then bake it so that it's hard. So, and then I painted it with this yellow ochre color. If they had a lot of money, they would gold leaf these things, but oftentimes they just painted them, usually this kind of yellow color. So now that I have this model, I can light it and photograph it in any situation I want, from any angle, with any light situation I want. So it might seem like a lot of work for a small thing, but I've used this model now many times for many other paintings because it's such a common figurehead. In other words, I paused my painting process and took about maybe a half a day in the studio to make this little model. But now, for years and years, I have this perfect reference anytime I need to have a figurehead from any angle. As I always tell my students, the methods that I use like this are not creating more work. I don't want to make it more work for myself. Doing the extensive research, posing people, building little models, it's not extra work, it is the work. All my methods are to make my work go better and my work flow faster, really. In the end, in the end, it's faster and better to do it right instead of cutting corners. That's what I tell my students anyway. So this is the almost finished painting. You can see everything's getting more and more detailed. And then that is the almost finished painting, a little further on, a little further. No rigging yet. You can see there's no rigging. That's the very end. The rigging, I have to let this everything dry before I put the rigging on. Getting these close. Then only towards the end do I start using smaller brushes and making the details. And then there is the finished picture. And all framed up, ready to go. Show you a quick detail of it. There's my little, you can see my little figurehead there. So that's how a painting comes together. So people often ask, well, the most common question I get is, how long does it take to make a painting? And I can never really answer that because I never really count up the hours. Someday I really should, like a lawyer, keep track of every 15 minutes in the office. But I I work on lots of different paintings at one time, and then I'm on the computer, and then I'm painting. So there's no way to really count it up. But I can say that all that prep work, all that research I've been showing you, all that sketching, all that planning, that's where the work is. The actual painting itself, taking a blank canvas and turning it into a painted canvas, that might take, a couple of weeks perhaps, but all that other stuff is where all the work comes in. So in a sense, a painting might take about 3 weeks, but it also takes 20 years to do a painting like that. So I've got lots more to show, but I thought it might be a good chance to take a little break and have questions if you want to, if that's up to Kathy and Heather, if you have any questions that are relevant so far.
Yeah, again, like I think there's several questions about painting water and waves, and
Yeah.
how you achieve like different textures and how you come up with the plan for that.
Very carefully. That's not an easy question. Basically, I study water anytime I can. I was recently lucky enough to be sailing island to island in the Caribbean a few months ago, and I found that what I noticed was the water was sort of a different color than I usually paint. The water was almost a violet color, which I wasn't expecting. I always paint my water sort of a blue-green. I use a mixture of ultramarine blue and raw umber and yellow ochre to get a sort of a greenish, dull green, blue, gray type color. But I found that the water in the Caribbean anyway was sort of a violet color. So I've actually sort of changed my colors just a little bit. But I studied the way it's almost more useful than studying pictures of the water is studying the way other people paint water. People find artists paint water differently, and you can almost tell who the artist is just by looking at the water. Um, Everybody has sort of a distinctive style. And basically, the key is that the water is a mirror, a very imperfect mirror, a mirror with lots of facets. It doesn't reflect quite as much as a mirror, and it also is broken up into thousands and thousands of little facets, and some of them happen to reflect back into your eye, and some of them don't. So some of the faces of the ocean are reflecting the sky behind it, and some of the faces are facing you and you're looking straight into the water. And the water has its own local color, its own actual color. And then on the side of the water that's happens to be facing the sky, it's reflecting that sky color mixed with the local color of the water.
And I'll ask a couple other painting process questions, and then you can jump back into it. A couple of people ask about how you lay in the rigging. How do you create those really fine lines?
Again, very carefully. No, but it's, let me see, it's, here's my brushes. It's not really, most people think it's about tiny brushes. It's not really about tiny brushes. It's about a very fine point. If you have a brush, if a brush is fairly large, but has a very, very fine point, it holds more paint. When you have, there are brushes that are called riggers. And I think that they're called riggers because in the old days they painted rigging with them and they're very, very fine and very long. But the uh, these brushes hold more paint, so you don't have to keep stopping and dipping it in the paint and bringing it along. So if you have the key is have a very fine point. And then you also use a stick. You can use a straight edge, uh, which is somewhere over here, and you can sort of lean your brush against the straight edge and kind of pull down like this, pull down like this along the straight edge to get that line. But you always you start like at the masthead and you end up at the tip of the bowsprit. You start and you you get going, and it has to be a little bit of a curve because there's very few of them are straight lines. They're almost always have a curve, and then you start getting down towards the end and you realize you're going to miss the end of the bowsprit. So then you have to wipe it off and do it again. That's why it's better. You want to let the painting below to be pretty dry before you do that.
Yeah. And one more question, kind of about process here. What kind of lighting do you use to while you're doing this work with doing all these fine details?
A lot. I like a lot of light. Let me see if I can turn my computer. I'll show you. See, there's three lights. See those lights up there? I those I put those in. This was purpose built as a studio. I'll show you that in a little bit. And then I have these lights behind me. These three lights on either side of my head right now. So I use a lot of light. But the color these days, it's really easy to buy daylight balance bulbs. So the color is usually I buy these LEDs that are daylight balanced. But then you don't know how they're going to be seen in real life. Like they're going to be in some gallery or in a house. You don't know what kind of light they're going to have. So a lot of people really worry about the color of the light they're painting under, but then you don't know what kind of light it's going to be seen under once it leaves your studio.
Yeah. So I'll let you get back to it. There's other questions kind of about your inspirations, how you got into this, who are your favorite maritime painters, but keep going and we'll kind of
Can
circle
answer
back
all those,
to
but
those.
I can answer all those, but some of those might be answered in the next few minutes here. So I'm going to share my screen again. Apologize if I'm clearing my throat a lot. I recently got over COVID. Um, yeah, so let's move on. So I'm going to show you one more project that I worked on. It was a really big one. It was for a hotel near DC in what's called the National Harbor, right on the Potomac River. This is the hotel, the Gaylord National Hotel. As you can see, it's really big. This is the inside, the atrium. It's really quite impressive when you're inside there. So they wanted, they're right on the Potomac River, and they wanted to see a scene of a sailing ship sailing up the river. So I did some research and I found that the USS Constellation had sailed right past that future hotel site on its way up to Washington in 1871. So the Constellation is still around as a museum ship here in Baltimore. It's often mistaken for the better known Constitution up in Boston. And it's sometimes mistaken for the earlier ship called Constellation. But this is a ship that was built just before the Civil War down in Norfolk. So since I was going to be placing my ship on the Potomac, just upriver from the hotel off of Washington, D.C., I did a lot of research about Washington at that time. I was able to find this incredibly detailed bird's eye view on the Library of Congress website that you can download at a very high res. It seems to show every building in the city. This is just a, you know, small part of it. Obviously, the Washington Monument, you can see the Smithsonian there. Uh, you can see there used to be that botanical gardens there right in front of the Capitol building. So this is how they depicted the waterfront. I don't know if you know DC, but this was the Long Bridge. Now it's about where the 14th Street Bridge is now, but there was a train going right across the water at that time. So I compared this view from 1880 with another view from 1916, and you can see that they're quite different. And I realized that since I needed to paint the old shoreline, I had to try to figure out what Washington looked like from the water. So what I did was I took this old map this is from the early 1800s. You can see there's the Capitol, there's the White House, called the President's House here. Washington Monument would soon be here, the mall. Uh, I took this old map and I drew the shoreline of that map. And then, so there's the shoreline with the major buildings shown, Smithsonian, Capitol, White House. And then I took this Google view of DC now, and then you superimpose that shoreline onto it, and you can see exactly how much of this is landfill. This was all very, very shallow anyway. So they filled a lot of that in with landfill. And you can see the Washington Monument's right there. There's the Lincoln Memorial way out on the landfill there. So I was able to take that. Oh, yeah, and the Jefferson, that's the Jefferson Memorial down there, tidal basin. Long Bridge was right here. That's where the 14th Street Bridge is now. Anacostia River, there's the Navy Yard over there. So at that point, what I did was I plotted the main landmarks. So there's the Washington Monument, White House, Capitol, where they're located. And using that, I decided where I wanted to place my ship based on where I wanted the monuments to be in my composition. So then I had to start doing a bunch of research. This is what the Washington Monument looked like at the time. It was a stump. They ran out of money after a while, and the Washington Monument looked like this for quite some time. You can see the front door is way up in the air. They built a big mound over, up to the base there much later. I found some good information about the constellation, exactly the way the hull was built. Found a bunch of old prints of the ship, even old photos, because this was, 1880s, 1890s, you start to have photography. And then, of course, the ship itself is still here in Baltimore. So obviously I went down there and took a lot of pictures. There's the fiddlehead, not the figurehead, but the fiddlehead. If they had a sculpture up there, it was a figurehead, but very often they didn't have enough money to have a whole figurehead. So they put this decorative scroll work on it. It's called a fiddlehead. And then the cat head, as many of you probably know, the cat head hauls the anchor up. Traditionally had a lion's head on the end of it. I don't know, maybe some of you know. It's called a cat head. I don't know if they put a cat head on the end of it because it's called a cat head or the other way around. Not sure. So lots of good details of the constellation, soaking up the atmosphere of the whole place. So then it's time to start drawing. I did sort of my drawing of what the constellation looked like, the whole sail plan. And then, without going into too much detail, there's my pencil sketch. You can see, and then the color sketch. You can see the Long Bridge here. I really wanted to get that train on there because I thought that was so unusual. Those trains. I wanted for me to get a train in my picture. Whoops, it's going backwards. And the stump of the Washington Monument with all those cranes on the top of it. You can see the White House over there, the steamship. Little guys, I found a lot of pictures of that era showing guys rowing crew like that. So I wanted to get that in there. That's accurate to the period. So then it was time to start the paintings. These were really big paintings that were going to go in the lobby of that big hotel I showed you a couple of minutes ago. So it's the first time I've ever stretched a canvas that big. I think they were 5 feet by 10 feet. I think they were. There was two of them. Um, so start blocking it in. The key is big brushes. How do you paint a big painting? You use big brushes. Uh, First, I did a sketch I can show over here. You see this? This is the second painting that I did. And there I did a full-size painting essentially as the sketch. And then using this painting that's right here, I used that I essentially just copied this at a big size. Starting to get smaller brushes for the smaller details. And so that's the final painting. And then here's the framers taking the painting out of my studio, bringing it to the framers. And then I was curious about how they were going to get this into the hotel. How do you get something so big and unwieldy into the hotel? And the answer was they just walked it right through the front door. They just took it out of the truck, carried it right through the front door of the hotel. This is the second painting that I did that I haven't shown you sketches for this one. And then they walked it down the hall, you know, and then and there are the two paintings installed behind the lobby, behind the desk, the desk there. So that's how that came together. Let me tell you one more story and then we pause for questions again. How about that, Kathy? So this is something that happened a few years ago. I had a show in Portsmouth, Virginia, called The Civil War at Sea. And it was a really nice gallery. And I did all these paintings about the Civil War because they're very appropriate to that location. And they put together a really nice show. Now, NMHS was nice enough to put it on their cover. And I don't know if you guys remember this from how many years ago was that? And then
Autumn 2007.
yeah, and even it just put descriptions of the paintings inside. It was really terrific. The gallery had a nice opening. They even hired these guys that sing she shanties, and the local cable news came. But the reason I'm telling you all this is um, about 2 weeks after the show closed, this happened. The whole gallery burned down. Well, the gallery did not burn down. The church next door burned down. And this is the gallery here. And this is the church next door. But the gallery, the firemen decided that this building was so damaged that they knocked it down. They crushed it. And all the material was still in there. And they wouldn't let people go in and get it. The owners of the gallery were like, look, the windows are all burned out. I can just stand on the sidewalk and reach in and grab something. And they were like, no, no way, it's not safe. So, um, maritime paintings, antiques, everything. You can see this is one of my paintings right there. So the thing is, um, most of the paintings had been sold. This was after the show was over. And most of the paintings had been sold, a lot of them because of the article in the magazine. So people in remote locations saw the article, bought the painting, but hadn't picked them up and they hadn't been shipped out yet. So those paintings, those are mostly the paintings that were lost. I still had three paintings that hadn't sold, so they were my property. They were lost. But it was distressing for me, but it was a real tragedy for the owners because they lived upstairs. So they lost their business and their home and all their inventory all at once. So luckily, my favorite painting was rescued. It's a painting of Charleston Harbor. So this painting, the one that was on the cover of the magazine, actually, that one was pulled from the rubble after it was knocked down. The building was knocked down, and they called me up and they said, "Hey, we got one painting. You know, it's a little damaged, but sort of okay. You can probably fix it." So they sent it back to me, and it looked like this. Like I was saying, no, that's not fixable. I think that's a total loss right there. So that's another. This is another good chance for a break if anybody wants to
I'm
ask any
I'm
questions.
I'm just I'm speechless after that part of the
You know
story.
what?
Oh my gosh.
You know what's interesting though is that I had another gallery that I was in also burned down. I don't. Must be. Maybe it's me. I don't know. I was
Ah,
in this gallery in Carmel, California, and they weren't really doing anything for me. So I was going to call them up and ask them just to send the paintings back because there was no movement. And so I Googled them in order to get their phone number. And when I Googled them, turned out the gallery was had burned down like 2 months ago. So anyway, so I just gave that up as a loss. So I'm not sure if there's something I'm doing wrong.
oh my gosh. Well, some of the questions that have come in are asking about how you got your started uh, painting well,
Yeah.
painting in general, but then maritime topics.
Let me see. I don't think I'm going to talk about that. Actually, I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but
Okay.
I could talk about that forever. Um, I went to UVA undergrad and got a degree in biology back in 1982. I guess I graduated, and then I was working as a draftsman in a naval architecture office back in the days of T-squares and triangles and rulers, before computers. And um, I suddenly realized after I graduated from college, like, oh, I should have been an illustrator. What was I thinking? I should have been an artist. That's what I like. Well, why did I think I wanted to be a doctor? And so I started shopping around for art schools. I went to an art school here in Baltimore by coincidence because I didn't live in Baltimore. Um, and then I dropped out. Once I realized I wasn't getting what I wanted out of art school, I wanted them to train me to be an artist instead of giving me assignments and grades and assignments and grades. I wanted it to be like a trade school, like teach me how to be freelance illustrator. It's like going to bricklaying school. Teach me how to be a bricklayer. But instead, it was all theory and it was just assignments that, I'd had 4 years of, I was pre-med at UVA. That was not easy. And I didn't give a fig about grades and assignments. I just wanted to train to be an artist. So after a year and a half, I realized I wasn't going to get that. And so I just dropped out and started freelancing. And I haven't had a straight job since. That's back like in 1986.
And we're very happy. We're very happy that's the case.
So I started out as an illustrator. I worked for ad agencies for a long time doing storyboards. And then I started getting some children's book works. I've done illustrated a whole bunch of children's books and I wrote and illustrated a bunch of children's books. And then I'll show you, I wrote this book. I wrote and illustrated this book back in 2000. And it's about sort of the famous ships that most people might have heard of. The Bounty, the Mayflower, the Nina Pinta Santa Maria, etc. And then after a while, I decided the illustration work wasn't going all that well after a while. And I was like, maybe I've heard about there's galleries that just sell maritime paintings. Maybe I can do that. I like that. I could do that. And so I took some of these paintings that I did here, and I brought them to the Annapolis Marine Art Gallery. And I showed them to him. And he said, yeah, we can, we might be able to sell those. Maybe, I'm not sure. So he took some and he sold them. And then I did some paintings especially for him. He sold those. And then I did some more. And then it just kind of snowballed from there. That was sort of in about 2000, 2001 that I started really concentrating on maritime paintings for the gallery market rather than being an illustrator.
Well, we're certainly glad you did.
That's how I
And
did.
thanks for the sea history plug.
That's the story.
So yeah, I'll let you keep going here, and I'm kind of keeping an eye on the
Yeah,
comments as
okay. I
well, and
need to
we'll hit those at the end.
looks like I need to speed up here a little bit. So, share screen. So I always like seeing other artist studios. So I'll show you mine. This was when I first came to Baltimore. I was in this old restored mill. That was my first studio. Um, this really beautiful old restored mill. These big giant windows. Um, and then I decided when my son was young that I would move my studio back to my house. So this was the back of our house at the time. You can see this weird boxy addition there. So we built the studio sort of under and out from there. So some progress on building out a studio. And then that's what it looks like now. And that's where I'm sitting right now, right inside this window right here is where I'm sitting right now. Uh, and there's the studio. So, just quickly, I'll brag about two really nice things that happened. One in my career, highlights of my career. One was I had a big show at the Naval Academy Museum, a retrospective show of all of my paintings. Not all of my paintings, obviously, but they borrowed some paintings back from some of the people who had bought them. Some of you may recognize Jim Cheevers there, the curator at the Naval Academy, not touching the painting, coming awfully close to touching it, but he's not really touching it. And then uh, this little group called the National Maritime Historical Society was kind enough to give me their Distinguished Service Award. Some of you may have been there in this room. This is at the Press Club in Washington, D.C. Phil Webster, I see you there. You organized this whole thing, so or helped anyway. So that was definitely the highlight of my career. I got to pontificate, bask in the glory of it a little bit. So I'll end with this little story. Um, a few years ago, my mother brought over some things from my childhood that she had saved all these years, like old school photos and report cards and childhood artwork. And one thing she brought over was this old watercolor. It's dated 1973, so I was 13 years old. Back then, I used to spend a lot of time at the kitchen table creating like elaborate scenes of jousting knights and Indians and teepees and sinking ships. I can actually remember working on this painting, and I remember thinking, this is the best painting I've ever done. Well, I mean, it's not, it's a great painting, but the reason I bring it up is that when I saw it 30 years later, what struck me was I was working on this painting in my studio at the time. Apparently, I think Viking ships all have red striped sails. I'm not quite sure. A couple of years before that, when I was doing children's books, I had done this painting. So that's when it really struck me that well, not much has changed. You know, just like when I was 13 years old, I sit in my studio creating elaborate historical scenes. You know, I've always known that I love my work, but it hadn't really struck me until then that I've managed to build a career out of what comes most naturally to me. It's what I would do even if I didn't need to work. And I plan on keep on doing it just for as long as I can get away with it. So I'll leave you this one last picture from my childhood back in 1971. I guess I was 11. Our local school had a sidewalk chalk festival. They emptied out the parking lot and provided a lot of chalk and invited kids to come draw on the asphalt. And here's what I drew. There, there's that damn Viking ship again. So that's all I got for you. Any questions, comments, suggestions, insults?
That should be inspiration to us all to pursue the things we want to do, because it's obviously if you're doing what you love, it comes through.
I never have to quit.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm never going to retire.
There's a couple questions about different medium. One question about what brands of paints and medium do you use for your oil paintings?
I am not a stickler for materials. I know a lot of oil painters and a lot of people sort of fetishize uh, materials. I use whatever works, but commonly I use gambling colors. I've got various, Winsor Newton and any brand, except for they sell certain brands that are made for students. I don't use those, but I'm not picky about the brand. I'm not particularly what I do like a good brush. But other I paint in oil paints with linseed oil and safflower oil, and I use big brushes whenever I can, biggest brushes possible. This is my most common size of brush that I do most of the painting with this brush. And then I move to medium-sized brushes as the painting progresses, and then smaller brushes at the very end.
And a question that came in before the talk tonight, and you talked a little about you did color studies in watercolor. There are questions about how could you do the kind of paintings that you do in watercolor, and is that possible? And it sounds like that's how you start out, right?
I do it. It's not. It would be hard to do them at this size. Watercolor is different. It's much less forgiving. You can't. It's very hard if you make mistakes to change anything. So I probably couldn't paint these paintings like you'll see that big one there. I really couldn't do that at that size in watercolor, but I can do the little sketches in watercolor. But I do a lot of digital sketches too. So, and that allows me to make a lot of changes to be much more flexible.
Yeah. Here's another question. Do you ever do prints or posters of any of the paintings you do?
Sometimes I do prints. Sometimes you guys have sold some of my prints, but
Sure
I
have.
found that no, I mostly just concentrate on originals.
Yeah.
Mostly.
I'm interested to hear this question from Rick Van Hemmen. Have you ever done a painting where later you learned that was historically inaccurate?
Um, Probably. I can't think of one off the
Pick your
top of
number
my
12.
head, but I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I'm sure there's always somebody out there who knows more than you do about flags. There's somebody out there who knows everything about sails and sail handling, or everything about water and the way water behaves, or there's often experts on cannons and such. And these people can't wait to find the mistakes in your painting and point them out. And so as long as they point them out before I finish it, then it's fine because I like to get it. I can geek out about the details as much as anybody. That to me is the fun part is getting it right. So if you tell me afterwards, after it's hanging on somebody's wall, then it's kind of too late.
I mean, that's it from the way you talk about it. That's where you get a lot of the satisfaction is
Yeah,
doing that research and doing, well, what you said, doing it right.
getting it
And
right.
then the painting just kind of flows from there.
Yeah. Somebody could probably tell me who said this. If a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing right.
Yeah. Well, and here's some practical questions. Where can we buy your work? And Wendy points out that prints are available on your website. But with your original works,
Uh,
where do people get in touch with you, or where are they hanging in galleries, things like that?
I have a gallery in Newport, Rhode Island called the Mariner Gallery, a gallery in Connecticut called J. Russell Janician Gallery.
Sure.
We just had a show in Sarasota at Palm Avenue Fine Art Gallery, Sarasota, Florida. And I'm missing one. I'm forgetting one. I have some smaller amounts of paintings in some other places, but those are the main places. Or one can always get in touch with me directly to commission something. But I don't have a group. I don't have a collection of paintings here that are for sale. I send them straight out to galleries.
Oh,
So you can't really buy a painting from me straight. You could commission me to do a new painting, which is mostly what I'm doing now is commissions for new paintings.
Here's one. This is an interesting one. I hope this isn't offensive. Do you
Oh,
use AI as part of your digital
yeah.
sketching?
No, I wouldn't know how to. I use digital. I do use Photoshop, but in Photoshop, you still have to draw the thing. It's
Yeah.
just a different tool. Photoshop is just a different tool. You can use watercolor, you can use gouache or oil or Photoshop. It's just another tool to draw. Now, AI, I wouldn't. I don't know what that's going to do to the business, frankly, to the whole art business. I know it's completely tanking the illustration business. I teach illustration at Micah, and it's completely erased the career path of illustration. I think 90% of the illustrators are going to be out of luck. So I don't know what if it's going to affect my business. I'm creating a physical product that you put on the wall. I wouldn't trust AI to be accurate enough for what I'm doing, I guess. I frankly, I don't know, but I know AI is going to ruin a lot of things,
Yeah.
you know. But it's so if it's gonna is it gonna ruin my business? I can't say, but it's ruining some parts of the art business and the writing business, as you all know, right? Yeah.
Well, it's because what you do is all about the detail and the research and the historical accuracy. I don't know how or why you'd want to replace that. Um, but
Yeah. I don't know. That's a whole nother topic of conversation, but
that is
hopefully there will always
that
be
is.
people who will appreciate. Some people have told me that in the future, hand done artwork will be even more valuable because it will be even more rare
Yeah.
because fewer and fewer people are doing it. Art schools aren't, they're not teaching it. So maybe that's true. I don't know. I don't know.
Um, and well, and so you're a member of the American Society for Marine Artists. There's some questions here about um, uh, uh, are you available for consultation or critiques? Where can people who are interested in marine art get involved, or kind of have a peer group? And asthma, I'm guessing, is a good place to do that.
Well, yes, I'm the president of the American Society of Marine Artists, and we're working on creating sort of a more rigorous members back room, where we're planning on having members send in tips and tricks, and members send in member events, like I'm going to have a show here and there, and also like a chat group, hopefully, if people want to chat among themselves with other artists. But join American Society of Marine Artists and go to some of the events. I try to create as many in-person events as possible. Um, so that's what I would say. Yeah.
Well, and that's a great segue because we're past our hour limit here. So we'll wrap up. But another thing um, uh, that we NMHS and asthma are doing is we have a marine art show coming up in June.
I
Yeah, so we partnered together. This is a virtual show. And so we had something like 340 different works that were submitted by over 100 artists. So that show was just put together, and we'll have that up online June 1st, and it'll be gone up through the month. 44 paintings that uh, made the show. And those works will be available for sale with a portion of the proceeds going to NMHS, as well the bulk of that going back to the artists themselves. And if you liked what we were talking about tonight with Patrick, next month on June 5th, for our monthly Thursday speaker series, we will be having the top artists from that competition to talk about their work. So I want to thank Patrick for being so generous with his time and sharing about what you do.
well, thank you. It was lots of fun. I get to sit here and talk about my favorite subject, me.
Well, again, I really appreciate you doing this, and I appreciate Asthma working with us so closely. Again, if you enjoy this, come back next month, and we'll have lots more about marine art. And of course, in Sea History, one of the things we're always featuring is different marine artists. We'll be featuring the winners of the show and our summer issue that'll be coming out and just a few more weeks. So again, thank you all for coming. Thank you,
Thank you.
Patrick.
Thank you for everybody for coming. And thank you, Kathy, especially, and NMHS.
Absolutely.
Okay.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Everybody have a good evening.